primarily talking to Jews. Now, really, that's 1 through 7. And then when Jesus said we went over this, I think, last Wednesday. When Jesus said in 1:8, he said, "You will be my witnesses both in Jerusalem and all Judea, and then Samaria, and unto the uttermost parts of the earth." What does that provide? Basically a what?
What's the question?
I'm sorry, what was that?
The spread of the gospel.
Yeah, it's really an outline of the book. Because you've got the centralized, the Jerusalem church in those first 7 chapters. 7th chapter, we've already, in our studies, we have the death of Stephen. And then in 8:1, on that day there arose again a great persecution against the church, and that caused them to do what? To scatter. Philip went down to the city of Samaria and proclaimed unto them the Christ. And we have the conversion of whom in chapter 8? Also Simon the sorcerer, and then the Ethiopian eunuch. Chapter 9, the chief persecutor against the saints so far, Saul of Tarsus. And in 931, then all the church in Judea and that area had peace, was multiplied, and so on. And then at the end, we had Peter moving from Jerusalem over to Lydda, where he healed Aeneas, and then he goes to Joppa, where he raised Dorcas. And he's poised there in Joppa, ready to go to Caesarea, chapter 10, to convert Cornelius. And so, really, as we've mentioned before, 8 through 12, I've been trying to emphasize this in our Thursday morning class. 8 through 12 become what I consider transition chapters, transitioning from the Jews in Jerusalem and primarily Peter to Paul's work to the nations of the earth, the ends of the earth, as he said, or uttermost parts of the earth. And so in 7, we've already gone through 8, 9, and 10. Then in 11, with the conversion of Cornelius, what was significant about that was that he's the first what? Gentile, uncircumcised Gentile. There probably were proselytes. Chapter 2 mentions that. But the first uncircumcised Gentile. It was a big deal because, in fact, he had to explain his behavior in chapter 11 back in Jerusalem. And they could, in fact, the elders there called him on the carpet about that. And so he explained it and showed that the baptism, they reasoned that if God gave unto them the Spirit as he did unto us at the beginning, who are we to basically challenge God? Then they concluded, then to the Gentiles also hath God granted repentance unto life. Verse 18. So that's a big deal. We later on we'll see, and as we've seen in the epistles, circumcision is a big problem. And the reason it was a big problem is that the Jews were saying to the Gentiles, you need to be circumcised or you can't be saved. But circumcision, as I think all of us remember, Genesis 17, circumcision only identified a male baby as belonging to the covenant that involved which 2 of the 3 Abrahamic promises? Which 2? The nation and the land. Not the seed. The nation and the land. Well, it was the nation, of course, that brought Jesus into the world. It was the land in which they lived. The truth of the matter is what that meant was if the Gentiles had to be circumcised to be saved and then keep the law, then they had to become what Jews were physically and nationally in order to be saved. Was that a part of God's plan? No. And so it was an addition to the gospel, and that's why we have really a lot of information, a lot of ink, so to speak, was used to, should we say, inspired ink and divine ink, because of how much is written on that subject and the significance of it. Don't add to the gospel, which is a real problem that people have. So that's in chapter 11. He explains. Then we have an introduction to the church where? It was the 3rd largest city in the ancient world. Antioch of Syria. And so both Greeks as well as Jews make up that city. And so Barnabas goes there. Then he goes up to Tarsus. He finds Saul, brings him back to Antioch, and they teach much people. And the disciples were called what? Christians, first in Antioch. First, only 3 times the word's mentioned, and that's the first one. All right, so then we have a little point there that really will lead to a number of other things. Agabus signifies up in Antioch there's going to be a great what? Famine down in Judea, which also there was during the days of Agabus, Claudius rather. And so from that we can date a few things. Then 12, what do we have? The death of James, the brother of John, and the imprisonment of Peter, and then the death of Herod Agrippa, number 1, the first. And so all of that shows that, here's now, we've had the death of Stephen earlier, but now we have the death of one of the apostles. So though it doesn't come out and say it, it's almost like, okay, it's time. Let's get out of here, go elsewhere where people want to hear the gospel. So 13 through the end, we have a second major division of Acts, and that primarily deals with whose work? Paul's. And it's been stated before that almost the first 12 chapters emphasize, though Peter is generally speaking the leader among them, others are involved. James and John are involved. But 13 through 28 almost takes on the form of a biography in the form of following the work of Paul and his companions. Okay, so in 13 we have what journey? Yes, the first journey. 13 and 14 of the first journey. Primary, if you look at everything where he went, Antioch, Seleucia, to the Isle of Cyprus, and then he goes up and visits those Perga, and then Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, which were 4 major cities in what area? Galatia, southern Galatia. And so those then become very significant when we go read Paul's letter to the Galatians. And the events that happened there were, persecution followed Paul. There was some fickleness, especially at Lystra. They thought that Paul and Barnabas were gods, and then turned right around after they'd been influenced to stone them. And then in Galatians 1, I marvel that you're so quickly removing from him that called you the grace of Christ to a different gospel. As you can see, the reflection in the letters. I made the point on Thursday morning, and we'll stop after this. But I think it's helpful if you can kind of visualize these ideas. One is that Acts primarily follows, who's leading the charge. Paul, Barnabas, Silas, his companions. Romans, the Pauline letters, Romans and following, you're primarily dealing with difficulties, misunderstandings, or commendations for what's right among the people, problems among the people. So you've got kind of the leadership in Acts, and then dealing more with people problems in the letters, doctrinal problems, and so on. It's very similar in Kings and Chronicles. Kings, the kings in Israel and Judah. Chronicles, you for the most part, Judah and Levi. But then the prophets who were contemporary with the kings, you find out more what's going on with whom. Just like the epistles, the people. And so there is your emphasis of leadership in some, the emphasis of the people, what's going on, problems, difficulties, commendations, and all that. All together, when you put it all together, it's everything we need. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God. It's profitable, helpful, beneficial for doctrine, everything we need to know. Doctrine, reproof, tells us where we are wrong, need to make things right. Doctrine, reproof. What else? Doctrine, reproof, and correction. Where we're wrong, how we need to make it right, and then instruction, which is in righteousness, godly living, that we might be complete in Christ. Okay, so that takes us through 13 and 14, which 13 was the last place we were to read. Okay, comment or question?
It's interesting how in chapter 13, Saul's name gets changed to Paul.
To Paul, that's right. And it's Barnabas and Saul, And Paul and Barnabas. Paul and Barnabas takes the lead in that. Okay. All right. Very, very good. Let me see here. We're ready to go. We have been, for those of you visiting, we've been studying the life of Jesus. And we've come back down really to Friday night, Friday afternoon, the crucifixion of Jesus in the last week. So we've gone through these basic headings, and the last week or 10 days, and we pointed out that, whereas the Bible often covers many years in just a few chapters, here are just a few days, and the last 10 days covered in many chapters. And we've come to the apex of the Bible story. And here we are with the last, with Friday. And we're not going to go through the time, but we've got the events of Thursday with Jesus. The Passover is prepared. They come together. They eat the Passover, institute the Lord's Supper. Then the long speech in John. They go out, and then he goes to the garden. He's arrested and brought before, you tell me, the 6 phases of the trial of Jesus. The Jewish phases first, Annas, and then Sanhedrin. Good. They couldn't put him to death, so they took him up to Pilate, Herod, and then back to Pilate. And then he formally convicts Jesus. And so then they bring him out to crucify him. And they begin the crucifixion the 3rd hour of the day, about 9 in the morning. And we pointed out the 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. To the thief, verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. And to John, and his mother, to Mary, woman, behold thy son. Speaking of John, behold thy mother. And then those dealt with his sayings that had reference to others. And then relative to himself and his relation to God. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? We dealt at length with that. I thirst. And then it is finished. And then, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. So then we looked at the strange events that occurred. The veil of the temple was rent in two from the top to the bottom. The earth quaked. Rocks were torn or rent. Tombs were opened. Many bodies of the saints were raised and appeared to many in Jerusalem after his resurrection. The centurion declares what was obvious. Truly this was the Son of God. And then the multitudes who had been led away go back, beating their breast. What in the world have we done? And then this is where we were Wednesday night. Jesus is found to be dead. His body is buried and guarded in the tomb. So we've got this right before the resurrection. We got down on page 123 of our booklets, down at the very bottom. And we read all the passages that pertain to this in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And who goes to Pilate to beg the body of Jesus? Joseph of Arimathea. That's right. And what kind of a person was he? Good. He was righteous. What's that, David? He was rich. He was a member. He was a member, a counselor, or member of the council. And he had not consented to their counsel or their deed. So he begs the body of Jesus. And then in John's account, Pilate wondered if Jesus were already dead. And so he asked who? The centurion. And the centurion says that he is dead. And so he grants permission for Joseph to get the body. Well, so as Joseph goes to the cross, evidently there had been some mutual talk beforehand. He meets somebody else at the cross, Nicodemus. And they take a linen cloth, and can't you just, I picture, if it were just left up to them, did they have some kind of a hammer to take the nails out? Would one have grabbed his right arm and the other his left and kind of let him, you just visualize what had to happen, that the Bible just doesn't say exactly. But they took him and they wound his body up in this linen cloth, and then they took it very nearby there was a garden nearby in which there was a tomb. And who owned the tomb? Joseph, right. What was significant about the tomb? It was unused. It was a newly hewn tomb in which no man had ever been laid. And so they put him in the there. But as he, we've already got, Joseph has met up with Nicodemus. And John says, he who came to Jesus earlier, came to Jesus by night. And so we'll get to that in just a moment.
So if you think about that, and you know, the part that we went over about him being crucified, and one man couldn't have got him off the cross. You know, it had to be two to help get him down off that cross.
Probably so. There were 4 soldiers, Quaternion, that were responsible for that. It's a good point.
I've often wondered too, Joseph would have been pretty high up in the community, so to speak, and he has to beg for Jesus' body.
Mm-hmm.
And you just wonder, would he have even given it to anybody else?
Mm-hmm.
You
talking about Pilate?
Yes, if Pilate would have given the body to anybody else because of Joseph. It's speculation, of
Yeah.
course, but just because of who Joseph was.
Could be. Could very well be. I'm looking at John 19. Turn over there real quickly. John 19. Let's reread this last paragraph. John 19, 38. I've got 31 through 42, but 38 and following. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked of Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him leave. He came therefore and took away his body. The other accounts mentioned that Pilate was somewhat surprised if he were already dead. And there came also Nicodemus, he who at the first came to him by night. Your mind immediately goes back to what chapter in John? John 3. It's interesting that John will make little points like this, assuming the reader has read what he's written before. We don't read anything about Nicodemus except in the book of John. John 3, John 7, and here in John 19. And so it's like when he talks about this was the second miracle that Jesus accomplished. Well, the second one John mentioned. And so it's almost like you're camped out in the book of John. But let's move on here. He who came to him by night, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new tomb, wherein was never man yet laid. There then, because of the Jews' preparation, for the tomb was nigh at hand, they laid Jesus. Now, the preparation. Preparation for what? The day of preparation.
Beginning of the Feast of Tabernacles, not Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths.
Okay. Unleavened.
The feast that followed the Passover, whatever the name of that.
Right, unleavened bread. Unleavened bread, yes. The preparation, the day of preparation, though, was a weekly thing, preparing for the what day? The Sabbath day. But this Sabbath day happened to be called a high day because it was, as Gene just mentioned, it was the beginning of another feast. You had the 14th day of the first month of the Jewish year at evening was the Passover. And then on the 15th day, the 21st day, it was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Well, it just so happened that on this occasion, here Jesus is killed, crucified on Friday. Well, that's really the preparation leading into Saturday, or the Sabbath, which was a high day because it's the first day of another feast. So they didn't want those bodies on the cross during that. Even the Jewish law had stated that those who would be put on a tree were what? accursed. And they didn't want that. And so they were to go and get the body of Jesus. All right, we got some questions. We ended on the bottom of 123. When Joseph asked for Jesus' body, what was Pilate's reaction? And what did he do? We've already mentioned that. Pilate, what? He marveled that he was what? He was already dead. And so he asked the centurion, and so he gave the body to Joseph. All right, number K, next page. Why might Pilate have so reacted? Note the bottom of 1459 of your the physical death of Jesus. Why? It was short. You could go up to a few days, 4 to 6 days on the cross. Some did, but Jesus, was scourged. Most of them were scourged, but all the treatment that he received previous to that, in the Jewish trial, how he was buffeted and stricken, he was blindfolded, he couldn't see the body blow that come against him. All of those things happened to him. And then, of course, he was up the night before, the whole day and the night, and then the trials began and all these events. So he was in a weakened condition already. But who also met Joseph at the foot of the cross? Nicodemus. What and how much did he bring to anoint the Lord's body? Well, it was a mixture of what? Myrrh and aloes. And how much? 100 pounds. And in Tenney's, in Zondervan's Pictorial Bible Dictionary, he mentioned several things I thought that were significant. A Roman pound was about 12 ounces, about 4 ounces shy of what our pound is. So if you think 12/16, that's roughly 3/4 of a pound. So Nicodemus brought about 75 pounds, plenty to cover Jesus' entire body. Only a very wealthy man could have made such provision. Myrrh was one of the most valuable of the gum rosins, either naturally or when the stems are injured. The gum oozes from the shrub-like tree. The pale yellow liquid gradually solidifies and turns dark red or even black. This aromatic gum was sold as a spice or medicine. Remember, the wise men brought, what did they bring? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Isn't it interesting? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Not too long after his birth. And here, myrrh is used even in his death. It's almost like bookends of Jesus. Aloes is defined as a member of the lily family. This plant has a cluster of thick, fleshy basal leaves which contain aloin, a substance which dissolved in water and added to myrrh was used by the ancients in their highly perfected art of embalming. All right, we learn about Nicodemus from other passages that he was a what of the Jews? A ruler who once came to Jesus by night for an interview, and he also pled with his colleagues for law and justice in their dealings with Jesus in John 7. Thus, both Joseph and Nicodemus would have been members of the Sanhedrin and influential among the Jews. Both show a marked degree of courage to do what they did. I thought about preaching on this, and what I'm about to do will short circuit all of that. But a friend of mine up in Athens one time said he felt like he had wasted good sermon material on bulletin articles that he had written. I want to call your attention to something. Let's see, here's our. There are only three instances in the Bible where Nicodemus is mentioned. John 3, when he came to Jesus by night, and then John 7, where he argued with the members of the Sanhedrin. He said, our law demands that we hear a man before we make some judgment against him. And then here in John 19, where he where he is with Joseph. And it's not stated in so many words, but it seems obvious that they had some talk before this, that they're going to get together and do this, because he meets him there and he's already prepared all of this. But in thinking about Nicodemus, I'm reminded of 2 or 3 things that seems to just it's like, please don't miss this. In John 3, it doesn't say that he asked Jesus a question, But it does say that Jesus answered him. He came to Jesus and said, we know that thou art a teacher come from God, for no man can do these miracles that thou doest except what? God be with him. Then it says, and Jesus answered him and said, except a man be born again, he shall not see the kingdom of God. So evidently he had some questions relative to the kingdom, and Jesus went ahead and asked him. In chapter 7, they're ready to take Jesus and do all kinds of things with him, and he comes to a defense of Jesus. And we need to investigate. We need to basically let him talk for himself. We need to investigate. And then here in John, the 19th chapter, he actually moves. He boldly goes to Pilate and begs. And he had been what kind of a disciple beforehand? A secret disciple. But he goes boldly and begs the body of Jesus from Pilate. Do you see something here?
It's a progression.
There's a progression. And I can't help but think, when Jesus said in Matthew 7 through 11, ask, and it shall be given to you. What's the next one?
Seek.
Seek, and you will find. And what's the next one?
Knock.
Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. There is a progression that, we might not know much, but at least we're curious. Well, then when we learn a little more, let's see more about that. Let's investigate. We're seeking. And then knocking actually indicates physical movement towards something. And you see that in Nicodemus. And I think also not only you see that, you see a progress in his faith. The very fact that he comes at night. We don't know why he came at night. It could have been the crowds. It could have been that he was somewhat afraid. We're just not told. And in the 7th chapter, he just makes a statement, hey, we're not doing what our law says. We let a man testify in his own behalf. We give him a chance we need to hear and see what's going on. And then now, what does Nicodemus bring? What's that? Spices. And he's right there with Joseph as he's begging. Joseph's already begged the body and gotten it, but now he's with Joseph as they bury the Lord's body. I tell you what, those kinds of ideas give me hope, because we may make all kinds of mistakes younger in life, and then we life is getting away. I want to do what's right. I want to be saved. And then we just make progress from there. And as long as we're making progress, the Lord's pleased with us. And we have to have that mindset. David, you had a hand up.
I was just thinking, and we can probably all relate to this, the more we read and study God's Word, it kind of grabs us and wants us to read more,
Yes.
study more.
Yes.
It's progressive also.
Exactly right. The more you know you don't know, almost. And that there is to know. And yes.
You got here Joseph, a member of the Sanhedrin.
Yes.
That's had him committed to be killed. Now he's getting the body taken care of, Jesus buried him.
Yes. Yeah.
I know they did a lot for his standing in the Sanhedrin.
Yeah. And you can see, it's almost like, okay, I've been a part of this, and I don't really know what's going to happen to me, among my colleagues when I do this. Word will certainly get out. And yet it's like he throws caution to the wind and says, well, I'm going to do what's in Jesus' best interest.
When they made comment, he was a righteous man.
Yeah.
To me, this shows his righteousness when he
Yes.
says, I'm going to do what's right toward God,
Yes.
regardless of what else happened to me.
Sometimes we look at the Sanhedrin and Pharisees in particular and say, they were just, they were every bit of them was terrible. Well, Nicodemus was a Pharisee and a ruler among them, and yet he turns. Who is the principal writer of the New Testament who was a Pharisee? Paul, yeah. And it's interesting then in Acts the 6th chapter, verse 7, that a great number of the priests became obedient to the faith. And so you've got a great number of the priests, usually they were from the Sadducean party, so you've got leaders who are It's not just everybody who was a Pharisee, everybody who was a member of the Sanhedrin was a bad person, carte blanche. There were some
It
people
boils it all
in
down to
this.
the individual.
I'm sorry, what was that?
It boils it all down to the individual.
Exactly, David. That's exactly right. And that's how the Lord deals with all of us, as on an individual basis. He doesn't do it by party or by, religious, political affiliation. It's all on an individual basis. Yeah, good point. All right. Read Isaiah 53:9 and Matthew 27:59 and 6. How are the two sides of that prophecy fulfilled? They made his grave with the wicked and with what kind of man? Rich man in his death. Almost a Hebrew dualism. But his grave with the wicked, the thieves. And then with the rich man in his death, whose tomb, to whom did it belong? Joseph of Arimathea, with the rich man in his death. Yes, sir.
I disagree with you.
Yeah, it's just talking with somebody yesterday about the idea of providence and how God can know things that will happen given certain circumstances, and yet does he actually make those people do that? They have he doesn't, but he can know things that will happen. And I'm trying to make the point before, in school, a teacher can know students well enough to know that more than likely this will happen with this student if I give this assignment, or if I see them over here. You can know them well enough where, given certain things, you can anticipate but God knows it for certain. But the idea is there. You don't make them do certain things, but based on their track record, inclinations, all that, you can pretty much tell where they're going. And so it's not Calvinism. It basically says, God is just, as a fellow said, God is a puppeteer. He's just pulling strings on you, and you have no choice. That's not it at all. Well, all of us have what? Free will, free moral agency. It's been called, yes. And and yet you have that plus what some of us call the sovereignty of God. God is an independent God. He's not lassoed down to and yet his will be carried out. And yet our free will is there too. And all of that goes together to fulfill these promises. And it's a lot for us to. All right, P. What information does John 19:41 add about Joseph's tomb? It was what? It was new, wherein no man was yet laid. And then I quoted from Hendrickson, it was new in the sense that it had never been used. Decay and decomposition had never entered it, which was more of a fit resting place for the body of Jesus. See Psalm 16:10. Y'all can quote that. His soul did not remain in Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. Flesh see corruption. This was fitting for deity. Faithful Jews were used to offering for the Lord those things that had never been used. Those passages there, Numbers 19:2, a red heifer that was to be used for the waters when people didn't know who had committed a certain crime, and they would take a red heifer on which there had never been a yoke. It had never been worked. Something that was special. The idea in Mark 11 verse 2, when the situation on the Passover, Jesus tells the two disciples to go into the city and you'll find there a colt on which no man had ever ridden. So you've got this idea of giving the best to the Lord, giving things that had not been used, not the leftovers. All of those ideas correspond in the death of Jesus to really everything we've read in the Old Testament. You're looking forward, doing the best, giving the best. Nothing is, I think I can safely say this, nothing is ever too good for the Lord. Would you agree with that? Nothing is ever too good for the Lord. He's deserving of our best, and then we wish we could do better. All right, Q. Who followed them to see what was done? Matthew 27, Mark 15. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Joseph, and the women who had followed him in Galilee. Right. What did they do after Nicodemus and Joseph buried Jesus' body? Luke 23 rather. They beheld there you go, Patty. They beheld the place or the tomb where the body had been buried, where they'd laid the body, and then they returned and prepared spices according to the burial, and then they did what? According to the commandment.
Kept the Sabbath.
They rested, that's right. They rested according to the commandment. So here they have, let's think now, about what time did Jesus expire? Around what time of day, we would call it? Around 3. And what time does the next day begin? About 6. So there's a limited time here, 2 or 3 hours that they have before they need to go back home and observe the Sabbath. So very, we get it done, but we can't do it all. And so they went back and observed the Sabbath as Luke's account occurs. I mentioned in the note under, R. What did they do? We did answer that. Jesus died about 3 on the day of the Passover, but this day also happened to be the preparation on that year. The Passover, we would say, would be on a Friday. Since the Passover fell on that day preceding a Sabbath or Friday, any day preceding a Sabbath was called the preparation, when Jews prepared for their day of rest. Therefore, the women had a very short time to prepare spices and ointments before the Sabbath began at sunset Friday evening. Context indicates Jesus' body was not completely prepared by Joseph. His body could have been kept elsewhere, but since the tomb was nearby, they may have thought to use it temporarily, finishing the Jewish embalming process at the first opportunity on the first day of the week. Women likewise evidently felt the burial was not complete and thus prepared the spices and ointments that the job could be finished on the first day of the week. Jesus' tomb, second note, Jesus' tomb figures prominently in the account of the resurrection. What happened at the tomb culminated what began on the cross. Keep in mind a few points in review and anticipation of his resurrection, where the location was. We cannot know for certain where it was, but it was in the immediate proximity of Golgotha, John 19:41. It was new, never been used, hence a fit resting place for the Lord's body. Its owner was Joseph, a rich man, hence Isaiah 53:9 is fulfilled. Its general appearance had a low entrance, as evident by the fact that Mary and Peter had to stoop to look into it. It had a very heavy stone rolled in front of the entrance that several women were not able to move, mentioned in Mark 16. It had a seal affixed to the stone, which would have been likely a cord covered with clay or wax on which a seal had been impressed, and also had a tomb chamber with elevations where persons could sit in. Between these, a declivity in which the body of Jesus rested. We'll notice when they came, they're angels, and they're there. One thing I wanted to mention, remember years ago, a fellow talking about how the contrast between how here these are very specific about the day of preparation, that would be Friday for them, that we need to do things to ready ourselves for the day, the Sabbath day. For us, a parallel would be, let's get things ready when for the Lord's day? Saturday. And to me, there's a huge contrast when people will stay out so late Saturday night. They don't take, they come in 12, 1 o'clock in the mornings, a Sunday morning, and then they come and then they get to services and they're tired. And they went to a football game, they're hoarse, they can't sing. As soon as that things begin to be a little quiet, they go to sleep. And it's just very opposite to me of what preparation was. I told Lee last night, I said, it just bugs me that these people who schedule these football games to start late at night, and if you're interested in the sport, and then you get out at 11 o'clock and the traffic and getting home, it's discouraging, but the truth of the matter is, when you don't consider the Lord's day, and you don't consider proper rest and things you need to do to get ready, then it doesn't matter. But we talk about differences between true Christians and the world. That's one of them. The Lord's day is significant to us. and that we make adequate preparation. I'm not saying that Saturday should be the day called the day of preparation, but I think there's a principle there, certainly, that we ought to give heed to making sure we've got things in order. All right, any comment, question? Okay, on the next page, Matthew 27. Let's read this. It's the last paragraph. I think we already did, but let's revisit it. Matthew 27, 62 through 66. This event is only mentioned in Matthew. Who wants to read here? Randy, if you would. Matthew 27, 62 through the end.
It says, now on the next day, which is the one after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I am to rise again. Therefore give orders for the grave to be made secure until the third day, lest the disciples come and steal him away and say to the people, he has risen from the dead. And the last deception will be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, you have a guard, go make it as secure as you know how. And they went and made the grave secure, along with the guard that set a seal on the stone.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Perhaps just a few questions on this. When did these gather together to Pilate? Some translations use a little different language. When, what? When? On the next, it's tomorrow, the next day. Some say what? When, it's not tomorrow, but when evening came. Now, think back. Matthew's writing primarily for Jews. Jesus is dead about 3. He's been buried. So the next day would actually begin, from the Jewish reckoning of time, would begin when? About 6 o'clock Friday night. And so that would be considered the morrow, the next day. So it's sometime, we'd say Friday night, that these Jews come to Pilate and said, hey, you know this deceiver, and that's some way of describing Jesus. The Jews say, this deceiver said, Jesus said in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth. He's the embodiment of truth. They had it all wrong. The deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise again. So based on what he said, that we need to do something about it, because the disciples will probably come steal his body and say he was risen, which they weren't even thinking about. I answered in the note under 1, some say the daylight Saturday, but the word morrow also means the next day. Since the Jewish day began at sunset, likely they came sometime after sunset Friday. Number 2, what were they concerned about, and how is that contrasted to the apostles and their concern? They were concerned about Jesus what? What's that, Patty?
He would be raised again on the third day.
Exactly. Jesus' prediction of his resurrection. And number 3, what had they understood about Jesus' teaching concerning his own resurrection? That he would be raised from the dead. Yeah, the third day. These Jews tried to cover all the bases. What did they think Jesus' disciples would likely do? Steal his body and then say he's been raised from the dead. And then they say that the last error will be worse than the first. And I've got a question on that, number 5. What 2 errors do they likely have in mind in verse 64? The last error would be the fact that they would dupe the people into thinking that Jesus was raised by their doing that. And then the first error likely would have been the very fact that Jesus claimed to be what? The Son of God. And so here's one error. Here's one worse than the first error, if we let that happen. I was reading where, well, we'll go ahead. If I have a minute, I might say that. Number 6, what 2 things were done to make it as sure as you can? Two things. They put a what around the stone? A seal. Yeah. It's kind of like the same word that's used. It really describes, well, we have seal-proof bottles, like, you know, if there'll be the top you screw off and there's a seal there. And you know if somebody has tampered with it because the seal is broken. And it could be plastic around it, but that's the seal. And in order to get to it, you have to break that seal. Well, they had that. Then the second thing they did was what? Post a guard there. And Pilate agreed. He says, you have a guard, you see to it. So I mentioned in the note, and we'll stop with this, it's evident that the Jews anticipated one of the very things suggested by unbelievers today as an explanation for Jesus' resurrection. That is, his disciples might steal the body. The Roman seal and the Roman guard saw to it that such a thing would not happen. Besides, the psychology is all wrong. Not one scrap of evidence indicates that such an idea even occurred to the disciples. In fact, it was just the opposite. They were somewhat down. What's going to happen? And here the women are, preparing some spices. They don't believe he's going to rise from the dead. They were still numb by the third day. And in fact, when Mary and some of the other women told the apostles, the apostles thought the women were what? Crazy. Yeah, they didn't know. In the nature of false causes, one could imagine how in a month or two, some fanatic might come up with the idea of stealing the body of Jesus in order to start a cause of his own. But this situation will be over one way or another by the third day. No disciple of Jesus would have been psychologically inclined to do such a thing as stealing his body within that period of time. Theory has to be false. Thought that was really good by the Walgreens. All right, lots of other reasons too why that couldn't be true. Anybody? Our time's about gone. Any comment or question? All right, Lord willing, Wednesday night we'll start with the resurrection, the appearances of Jesus, the actual event of the resurrection, and then the appearances will verify that he was all he ever claimed to be.